We might get started. This being Thursday and Dublin and rainy, we may well find that lots of other people join us as we go through the event, but I think it's a good idea if we get started now as soon as possible. Thank you very much indeed, first of all, for coming, and thank you, as always, to Trinity College and to the Trinity Amnesty Society Group for facilitating and hosting the event, along with our Israel-occupied Palestinian Territories group. You're very welcome indeed this evening. The idea of this evening is to highlight the various ways in which civil society is working to end the human rights abuses occurring in Israel and the occupied Palestinian territories. So I should first of all perhaps highlight a little bit about Amnesty's work generally on this issue, and then perhaps talk a little bit about what we hope might come out of this evening, or what the purpose of this evening is. Israel and the occupied Palestinian territories is a priority country for Amnesty International Ireland, and our Israel OPT group are perhaps one of the most active country programs that we have. All of them are indeed very, very active, but I think Israel and the occupied Palestinian territories are a group who, for very many reasons, many of them about the priority of that particular conflict here in Irish society, who are very dynamic and very active, and would, I'm sure, want me to invite as many of you here who have a particular interest in the issue and in the conflict and in the human rights issues pertaining to the conflict to join them. You'd be very welcome indeed to join the group. You got information about that on the way in. There's more information about that if you want it on the way out, or approach anybody who happens to be wearing a black and yellow Amnesty t-shirt, and they'll be able to advise you a little further. I mean, what I'd like to do first of all is perhaps sketch out the work that Amnesty International does on the issue. We are a human rights organisation, so the focus of our work really is on research. Research to identify with authority the human rights issues pertaining to the conflict and the situation in Israel and the occupied Palestinian territories, and then to use that research to both lobby and advocate at the level of national politics and international politics, so through national governments and then through intergovernmental organisations like the EU and the UN, to hold to account those responsible for human rights violations as part of this conflict. That's not all that we do. The individual action of Amnesty members through the classic Amnesty work of letter writing, petition signing, campaigning and lobbying is a huge part of our work. So on a very regular basis, you can have somebody sitting in a kitchen in Balmullet taking action. You can have somebody sitting in a UN office, an Amnesty staffer taking action at the EU, or indeed Amnesty members, group members and staffers can be speaking to the Israeli embassy here in Dublin, or even before the Joint Committee on Foreign Affairs, or lobbying our Ministry of Foreign Affairs on how they need to address, or what we think they need to do or say in relation to the issue. So that's the broad approach that we address to the systemic human rights issues arising out of the conflict and responses to the conflict generally. We're also very active in addressing individual cases. So we can be highlighting individual cases, and we're going to talk a little bit this evening about Mordechai Vanunu, one of the cases that we've been working on for some time. We're also active, for instance, in highlighting the case of Gilad Shalit, the Israeli member of the Israeli Defence Forces, who's been held in Gaza for some time, highlighting the need for the International Red Cross to have access to him in particular, and for family access to him. And routinely we're highlighting and seeking interventions and responses in individual cases, for instance, access to health cases. Cases of individual Palestinians, particularly in Gaza, who are unable to access appropriate medical services that they're in desperate need of, because they're simply not allowed to leave the territory and access health services perhaps in Israel or in Egypt or in other places. So our work is very broad but very focused, starting with the research, then building on that through lobbying at the national and international level, and individual membership action on individual cases as well as the broader issue. That's how we are addressing this particular conflict. Now, lots of people across civil society are working to address issues relating to Palestine and Israel generally. And of course there is a diversity of approaches. And depending on who we are as individual organisations or as individual activists, we may take different approaches. But we all add, I think, to what is an important mix of responses to what is both a humanitarian and a human rights crisis right across the particular region. Tonight we're going to hear about different approaches and different perspectives other than the Amnesty perspective, and we're delighted to be able to bring that here this evening. Both Denis Halliday, Mairead Maguire and then Barbara Faibish are going to talk to us in a perspective that is perhaps not an Amnesty perspective but of their own work. Both Denis and Mairead in particular will be well known to many of you. Denis is a former United Nations Humanitarian Coordinator in Iraq, who, as many of you will know, resigned in 1998 in protest at the UN economic sanctions on the people of Iraq. He now lectures and speaks on Iraq and human rights issues, the UN and its reform. Both Denis and Mairead were aboard the Rachel Corrie MV as part of the May Freedom for Gaza flotilla to bring humanitarian aid to the people of Gaza. Mairead Maguire, who will speak after Denis, will also be known to you, a Nobel Peace Prize laureate and co-founder of Peace People Northern Ireland. Mairead has travelled extensively to the occupied Palestinian territories and campaigned against the Israeli blockade and other human rights violations in Gaza. And our final speaker this evening, before we move to a question-and-answer session, is Barbara Faibish, who's a personal friend of Mordechai Vanunu, the Israeli nuclear whistleblower, and one of the cases that Amnesty is working to highlight and has been working to highlight for some time. So this evening is a broad discussion that's not about the Amnesty perspective on Gaza, but that's about the broad range of responses from civil society generally, and that brings in other crucial, important and insightful voices and perspectives. And quite frankly, I think you'll agree, we couldn't get more insightful voices in many ways than our speakers this evening. So without waffling on any further, I'd like to ask Denis Halliday to come and speak to us. Denis.
Thank you, Colin, for that introduction. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My presentation, small presentation I hope, is going to take us back to 1948, briefly, the UN decision, and forward to the present, looking at the human rights issues and conclude with non-violent suggestions as set out in the work of the Mahatma Gandhi. I don't plan to offend anybody here tonight, but I am speaking the truth as I see it, as I see the reality. And that's my view. You obviously don't have to agree with that. And as I see it, that is for both Arabs and Palestinians, and for Israelis. So I hope that approach will work and won't hurt anybody's feelings. I believe most of us would agree that unless Israel and her Arab-Palestinian neighbours get their act together, they will never get to experience living in genuine peace. And peace and well-being, human well-being, are fundamental human rights. Human rights that both communities have a perfect right to expect and to enjoy. My first concern is the globally recognized violation of human rights in respect to the Palestinian citizens of Israel and the Palestinian communities living in the West Bank, East Jerusalem and Gaza. In respect of these good people, despite their unending, terrible humanitarian plight, I think there is a sense of hope. Why? Because they've survived years, in fact they've survived generations of IDP and refugee misery with tenacity, with courage and with expectations that perhaps only a people without an alternative can sustain. They've been largely abandoned, except for the work of UNRWA, the United Nations, along with domestic and international NGOs in Gaza particularly, but also the West Bank and elsewhere in Lebanon and other camps. Whilst the political United Nations has tolerated numerous violations by Israel of the UN Charter, of the Geneva Conventions and humanitarian law. My second equal concern is for the people of Israel itself. Their well-being and their survival is in doubt, as long as they persist in aggressive military occupation, set aside the human rights of the Palestinians, act as though Israel were somehow exceptional and above the law, and rely on violence under protection of the US Big Brother. For them, I'm less optimistic. And that's because Israel must show respect for her neighbours and all of her own people, I'm thinking perhaps particularly of the 20% of Israeli citizens who are